Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Hello, I'm Major Chris Parker, and this podcast topic is Concepts to Doctrine in Waypoint 2028. With me today is Colonel E.J. Karlberg, Director of the Combined Arms Integration Directorate, Dr. Paul Reese, Director of the Fielded Force Integration Directorate, or FFID, and Mr. Rich Creed, Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, or CAD. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Now, before we dive into this show's subject matter, I think it's only right that we give a Breaking Doctrine congratulations to now Mr. Creed, who has since retired since our last show. Sir, after how many years?
About 32, Chris.
32, but who's counting, right?
Yeah, that's right. Goes by fast.
Forgive me, both our listeners and you, sir, for defaulting to Colonel Creed. If I do that today, it might happen. So, today we're discussing how the Army drives deliberate change across the force, specifically how a concept, once validated, becomes doctrine. And we're quite fortunate that, as an Army in transformation, we have an opportunity to witness this process in real time by using the Army's future operational concept, multi-domain operations, or MDO, and the accompanying implementation strategy, or Waypoint 2028. Now, bringing MDO to life will affect much more than just doctrine and is sure to impact how the Army organizes, trains, and equips the force. But to keep this manageable, I think it's best to start with the relationship between concepts and doctrine, and we can expand from there. So, Mr. Creed, could you lead us off by breaking down this relationship for us? I know we've covered this in previous episodes, but just in case our listeners are unaware, what's the difference between a concept and doctrine?
Yeah, Chris, so that's a good question because it comes up a lot, right? We talk about multi-domain operations as a future concept almost continuously. Strategic level leaders talk about it, but we don't fight off future concepts. We fight off our doctrine. So what Army doctrine says, we actually define ourselves. But Army doctrine are the fundamental principles with the supporting tactics, techniques, and procedures, plus the terms and symbols used for the conduct of operation and as a guide for actions of operating forces and elements of the institutional force, the institutional Army, that directly support operations in support of national objectives. All right, so it's the means and ways by which we conduct our business. Whereas concepts are ideas for significant changes based on new approaches to the conduct of operations or technology, or to address problems that current doctrine is insufficient to address. There's been some change in the operational environment, and the Army may need to change direction, for example. So we introduce concepts and experiment with those to solve those new problems for which doctrine is inadequate. There's some things to remember in that regard. We try to maintain a close when we say dynamic, we mean active, and complementary relationship between the development of concepts and the doctrine we have. In other words, we'd like to make adjustments from a known point as opposed to having a clean sheet and start from scratch every time we're looking at a problem. Doctrine's been with us a long time, and people have thought about many different types of problems in our Army's history over time. And sometimes, problems tend to recur that are similar, not the same, but similar to problems in the past. So we have a way possibly of thinking about that. So we say concepts should proceed from an understanding of existing doctrine and capabilities. And we say that because if you don't, you could say that this is a new problem, but it's really just new to you, and there's actually a bunch of people that have been thinking about it before. And so you see that phenomenon once in a while. The concepts can drive new ways to employ current organizations and capabilities. In other words, we have capabilities in organizations, but what if we change those around a little bit, reordered their combinations and the way in which we employ different capabilities in new and novel ways that creates a new way for the Army to conduct operations, but really doesn't require any new things so much as a new approach. And there's historical examples of that in the past, right? All the armies that started the Second World War in Europe all had motorized forces, they had tanks, they had airplanes, they had radios, and yet they fought very differently because they looked at those combinations and then they trained to those combinations differently from one another, some more successful than others. The other thing we say is that the elements of a concept that are validated by some level of rigorous analysis are what we can incorporate in the doctrine. So we don't have theoretical things that we put in there. We put in things that have been shown to work in one way, shape, or form. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about today, is how we experimented with some of these ideas to close some of the capability shortfalls. And we do that with war games, simulations, and exercises.
So now, turning a concept into reality is no small endeavor. It requires a comprehensive plan that accounts for each of the force modernization domains, being doctrine, organization, training, materiel, leadership, personnel, facilities, and policy, otherwise known as .mil PFP. Now, Waypoint 2028 is the first half of the Army strategy for redesigning the force to become fully MDO capable by 2035. But before we dive into the meat and potatoes of that, sir, Mr. Creed, can you shed some light on the origins of this effort? Like, where did this stem from?
Well, I think it was a kind of a perfect storm of the right senior leaders, a changing operational environment, a recognition that the Army needed to modernize and determine what it was modernizing for, what it was to do. And so there's a doctrinal aspect of that, to our refocus on large-scale ground combat operations against peer threats in our 2017 edition of our capstone operations publication, FM30. So there was that. The doctrine could drive a lot of the cultural changes, and it immediately started to have some impact in that regard. But when Lieutenant General Lundy was here and General Milley was the Chief of Staff, General Lundy was the CAC commander, General Townsend was the TRADOC commander, there was a lot of things going on at the highest levels in the Army in terms of making decisions about resources. And so what are our priorities for modernization? And we realized that while the Combined Arms Center here kind of has lead on that, there hadn't been a formal process for doing it in an integrated and synchronized way across all of the warfighting functions, across all the centers of excellence. And so people would joke about, well, we don't want to make decision by anecdote, right? Whoever told the most compelling story to the Army Chief of Staff or the Secretary of the Army.
Loudest voice in the room. Right?
Yeah, right, the loudest voice in the room, exactly. So let's try to take a deliberate, rational approach to this. And so General Milley directed the Combined Arms Center Commander, General Lundy, to execute what they called a gap study. And we didn't call it the gap study at first. It was a study to determine, in priority, what were the most important things that the Army had to do to modernize, with a focus on reorganization more than new equipment. In other words, it wanted to be budget informed. In terms of getting the Army to be prepared once again to conduct large-scale ground combat operations. And so we put a big team together here at CAC, the Center for Army Lessons Learned and the Mission Command Training Program folks, and then folks that conduct experiments across the Army over the last decade or so in various forums and entities, all our warfighting battle labs and so forth. We're tasked to go back and dig out lessons learned and trends over time that were things that we didn't do particularly well, and then figure out why. We went through as a team, more than 100,000 pages of documents, all kinds of findings and so forth, because the Army had validated almost, 1,000 gaps that every year were validated, and it's okay, we can't fix 1,000. So in the context of all these lessons learned and trends over the years, and then looking at a problem in a specific context. So we picked Europe, fighting a peer threat, 2 corps, 2 U.S. corps and an Allied corps. And we looked at it and go, okay, so in this context, what can we do and not do? And certain things popped out very strongly. They were very obvious. In fact, many of them were obvious, but they were only obvious after we did the process. We should have probably kind of understood that beforehand, but we didn't, because our Army was the same size in 2018 as it was 20 years ago, more or less, with it a few thousand. But it was a very different Army than the Army of 20 years ago. I mean, very different. We had evolved over time to certain kinds of fights. And yet we were preparing as an Army for a different kind of fight, a fight that was more typical, say, 30 years ago. And so all of that together kind of gave us a place to start. 100-page documents, some briefings, sharing it around to get consensus among the Army senior leaders that they agreed it was a problem. And then we said we weren't going to prioritize them. All 17 gaps were, and we just picked 17 because they were the ones that we figured if we didn't close them, they weren't going to be 100% closed, but we needed to narrow those gaps, or we might not be successful in the next big war. And so that was kind of the point of departure, and we've been refining that ever since. But that kind of set the stage for what Colonel Karlberg and Dr. Reese have been working on ever since. Is okay, we have identified what the problems are, and then in this budget-informed world, and a continuously changing operational environment, how do we prioritize what we need to do next?
Hey, Rich, can I just overemphasize 2 points real quick? I think one of the things that you mentioned that was really important about that was against a peer threat, right? Because our enemies had evolved over the last years, our operational environment had changed, and we needed to account for that. So a lot of the gaps dealt with capacity as well as capability. So I think that's important for everybody to remember as we go back and think about that. That was part of it. And then the other part of it is that there is reams of evidence that support all of that, right? Because we constantly get asked, and we're being asked right now as we go into and we transition into this waypoint portion of it is, well, how do you know that? What backs that up? What's the evidence, whether it's a war game, an experiment, an operational lessons learned from COL or something like that. So I think that's all very important, and that's the basis that we've used as we transition now to this next phase with what we're going to talk a little bit about the waypoint and aim point stuff. So I just want to kind of pile in on those 2 comments.
Well, I think we'll go back to this, so we may want to explain to everybody what the difference between capacity and capability is, because that's a huge point. In other words, when we say capacity, it's the degree to which you can do something, and capability is whether you can do it at all in the first place.
Right. No,
so some things you have to be able to do at scale and scope, particularly on the sustainment logistics side.
Yeah.
And that, I think, was the big wake-up call in many ways.
No, I agree completely. Yeah.
And if I can add, Rich, I think one of the things that we were going to talk about it later, but I think it's a fit now, because what else was going on in the Army at that time is you had AFC stand up, and you got chief sets of modernization priorities, equipping modernization priorities, and you could look at the 17 gaps as really organizational priorities, right? It's how the Army structures itself to get stuff done. It's some equipping, but it's really having the structure, the people in the right spot to do the right job to close that gap. Where now you've got General Murray and AFC and their modernization priorities, which are somewhat aligned to the 17 gaps, not because those were gaps that we're addressing now, both with material and organization. And I think that's really what Waypoint does, is tied into the modernization effort, because it provides landing spots. Because some of the material that General Murray and the Army are buying doesn't have a formation to receive it right now. So as we get into more detail, we'll kind of talk about where those modernization priorities will land.
Well, and then the Futures Command piece, so when we say AFC, we mean Army Futures Command. But this multi-domain operations concept, we started off talking about the difference. Well, that multi-domain operations concept had a very clear vision on, where the Army needs, the things that the Army needs to be able to do, the problems we need to solve. So we looked at those gaps through a multi-domain lens. And so some of those gaps are very specifically addressing, well, first identifying the problem and then allowing us to address multi-domain aspects of the operational environment, both the environment itself and then those threats or those adversaries out there, what they can bring to bear. So all of these solutions are MDO informed as well. It's not just purely a doctrine thing. It's MDO on top of doctrine, and then in a resource constrained environment where we need to make priorities.
So to kind of tie it to a doctrinal, concept here, we would say this is kind of like ADM. We have our current state with all its problems, and then we have our desired end state, and Waypoint 28 is that bridge to get there between the two.
To
the
the
desired
design
end state.
methodology. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So with that, I guess we'll transition now to dive in head first here with Waypoint 28. So Colonel Karlberg, sir, could you lead us off and come in with an overview of what Waypoint 2028 is and its various components or lines of effort?
Yeah, so I'll cover the we broke it down into 6 lines of effort. I'll cover the first 3 because at the time I was Army Capabilities Manager, Echelons Above Brigade, and so I covered most EAB, divisions, corps, and theater armies, and the integration of all the warfighting functions at those echelons. So the first 3 lines of effort. The first one is division as a formation, right? And optimizing BCTs to address one of the 17 gaps, which is lethality, but also mobility and reconnaissance and security. So, and this is a bit different than the division of the last 15 years, because divisions were headquarters, right? And then they would receive BCTs and they would see 2 BCTs. But one of the things that the gap study showed us is that you need a division is actually in large-scale combat is a tactical formation. It's fighting a tactical fight under the control of a corps, and in some cases that corps will be fighting a tactical fight. So you think of a division as a formation, it's got a BCT as the maneuver arm of that division. So, but to resource that, right, we've got 18 divisions. To resource all those divisions to do everything they need to do is resource intensive, and we probably won't ever get there. So what Waypoint did is we looked at 3 different types of divisions, really. You've got Joint Forcible Entry Division that can go establish the lodgement, do joint forcible entry, be that global response force. And then you've got a penetration division, think heavy, capable of crossing multiple wet gaps, able to penetrate a defending enemy and maneuver to a position of advantage and then penetrate that enemy. Mm-hmm. And then for the remaining divisions, the ones we can't resource, there'll be a standard set, but with the goal of, if resources come available, we can generate optimal formations. Heavy being penetration, and then joint forcible entry, and then probably a light variant with some resources to enable their operation. So divisions will be multi-domain maneuver capable. There are some intelligence really developments. There's some artillery developments that are on the horizon to enable them for longer range cannon shooting with the extended range cannon artillery capability. And then there are a couple of intelligence integrating systems that are coming online that will enable that division commander to develop the situation. And then, so as you think of making a division a formation, that BCT as it exists today, whether it's an AI or an S, probably doesn't need everything it has if that to enable that division commander to shape the fight. The division commander needs resources, right? So you think artillery, you think intelligence, you think engineer, mobility, counter mobility. You want that division commander to be able to weight the main effort as a part of his plan. So being able to give his main effort 2 DS cannon battalions to shape the fight, and then have resources, because all BCTs aren't committed at the same time. The follow and assume BCT doesn't need to have its artillery with it during that portion of the fight, and then you organize for combat. And what you'll hear some people say this is back to the future, but it's not really back to the future, right? Because you still have BCTs. BCTs have everything they need to operate, or they'll get it allocated from the division. So don't think of that. It's still a BCT that'll have all that capacity. So those are the main points on the division and the BCT. But when you look at the BCT, we're also looking at optimizing them as well, right? So you think a heavy BCT, there's some capacity inside the ABCTs today that was due to force structure decisions were changed. There's that lethality gap. So building out an armor BCT to have everything it needs, and then the division probably needs CAV, if it's a formation, a division cavalry squadron, to get after the division commander's IRs. They're building it out of Hyde right now. For every warfighter, a division commander builds a cavalry capability out of Hyde. So why not give him that from Jump Street, so it can so the Army command, train, and equip it, but so that squadron can train in its mission set all the time. It'll have a medal, yeah, for the division commander. Okay, but then you look at the infantry brigade combat team. There's got to be a better way to organize that formation, make it more lethal, more effective. And we've got a couple options there. One would be a completely tactically mobile IBCT, where every soldier has a seat in a vehicle where they can maneuver to their last covered and concealed position, dismount, and move from there. But then if they're successful on that objective, but then identify another objective, a terrain feature or two away, they can immediately mount back up, maneuver quickly to that objective. And then the other formation we're looking at is extremely strategically mobile formation, can deploy in, I think, 70.
Yeah, we're still working through.
Yeah, we're still working through the numbers, but less than a third the aircraft required for a current IBCT. It can deploy strategically, be in position, upgunned, mortars at every echelon, 11-man squads, and all the new kit with placeholders inside the formation for robotics and other capability and capacity that'll be coming online in the not too distant future, but also tailored for dense urban terrain and subterranean operations, because they aren't encumbered by all the wheels that are in the current IBCT.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point, EJ. Then it goes to what you were just talking about, this waypoint idea, right? So this is the two worlds kind of coming together, right? So you have our modernization world that's out there with Army Futures Command and things that they're bringing along, plus what we're doing with how we fight and how we use our doctrine to get after that. So now some of those things that Colonel Karlberg just explained, this 100% tactical mobility, wouldn't have been possible without some of the modernization equipment that is coming online from Army Futures Command, or some of the lethality that our squads are getting from Army Futures Command. So it's looking to the future a little bit, at the same time trying to figure out how do we use that as it's coming online to fight. So I think that gives us some options for senior leaders' decisions here in the future to bring those together as we go forward.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Dr. Reese. So what Waypoint 28 is options, right? We aren't saying that the Army has to have a certain number of joint forcible entry or penetration divisions or standard divisions. We're saying the Army needs this capacity, and within our current structure, these are options to get that capacity, both for BCTs, divisions, and then when you talk corps and theater armies, right, you're talking the echelon that'll probably be where convergence happens, right? When you're talking multi-domain convergence, just looking at the authorities to operate at the ranges that and over the systems that multi-domain operations happen on, you're talking at a minimum corps, but more than likely theater level. So your ASCCs or theater armies need capacity, and your corps need capacity to be able to feed the joint targeting process, to be able to integrate national level assets to bring to bear to accomplish the combatant commander's desired end state in that theater. So that's where our work is taking place there. But you also look at the other formations that the Army is experimenting with and standing up. The multi-domain task force operates at the theater level. It belongs to, most of them are service retained, will be service retained, but it generally will operate forward. And it's purpose built to do multi-domain operations. It's in the title.
Right.
So just to put some of these organizational changes into perspective, sir, so this is what we're trying to accomplish here, both from above with the theater armies and the corps, and below with how we're looking at the BCTs, is we're trying to enable that division commander and that division to be that decisive action, that unit of decisive action. Whereas modular army, it was the BCTs that were going to go out and do this. Now it's back to the division, and we're just trying to figure out the best table of options for that to happen. Correct?
Well, that's a very simple. I mean, yes, it's correct, but there's a very simple approach. And I mean, so that kind of becomes a narrative of sorts, right? And you know how much I hate narratives, But it's more a matter of how we got where we are. For what? When we went to the modular force, We never resourced the divisions and corps and theater armies as they were supposed to be designed at the time because our focus was elsewhere on building BCTs. Then we've cut them twice in terms of the force structure assigned to divisions, corps, and theater armies. And yet the number of missions that come up on them, whether we're talking about competition below armed conflict, right, or crisis or anywhere else, continue to get bigger. So if we look at this whole thing from a holistic standpoint and say we're really about building the most flexible army possible for the spectrum of competition, whether we're talking big wars, little wars, peer threats, or others, you have to fix some of the things that were the most broke. And just because we can gut things out at certain echelons now during, an exercise that's done in simulation or something that's done during competition with a lot of augmentation and deliberate planning doesn't mean that that's going to work in a fight. And I think that gets to the gist of this echelons above brigade challenge. Because there's a perception out there, those headquarters, they're too big, they don't do anything. Well, no, they've got a lot to do. They're busy as can be, all the time.
Yeah, and that's to play off of that. So that goes, our third line of effort was echelons above brigade command and control, right? So you look at our current threat, and they know where we are as soon as we turn our radios on. So the more headquarters that you put in the field, the more targets they've got, and they've got decent magazine depth. And so in the EABC2 work, we kind of looked at all the formations that are out there, not just BCTs, not just division headquarters and corps and ASCCs, but there's, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think it's like 200 plus EAB non-maneuver formations, right? And then everybody looks at them all the same. They look at a division headquarters and all those formations as the same thing, whereas a division, and this is General Rainey's line, a division and corps headquarters properly manned, trained, and equipped to do its mission set as a headquarters is tooth, right? That's a warfighting headquarters that is controlling operations. And then you've got all these other EAB headquarters that serve a purpose, and they receive capacity. They don't necessarily have a down trace. So through our work, we looked at all these formations to generate some options to both minimize the number of headquarters in the field, but also to optimize them. Because one of the things we found during the How the Army Fights work, which was in between the gap study and Waypoint, it was looking at the 17 gaps address a whole bunch of things. The challenge with the 17 gaps is the centers developed them, right? And everybody was so focused on their gap that they developed the best solution, paying inside their portfolio to build the solution. And they mitigated their gap. But the challenge was, and How the Army Fights did, and it occurred at the optimum time to do it, right as COVID hit. And the teams was coming up, and BTCs were open, and all the 06 leadership that needed to be involved was available. And we spent 3 weeks looking across the competition continuum, getting the centers that develop the gap solutions to lay out how their solution and how their warfighting function operated with that new capacity and capability. So everybody kind of laid that out. And looking at that, when we outbriefed General Rainey, is when he said, okay, we need some options to organize this so that we can fight it. Because that's one thing. The gap study addressed the gap. It didn't necessarily tell you how combined arms would utilize that gap in a fight against a near-peer threat. And so that's what Waypoint is options to do that.
Well, that's how you also could mitigate some of the zealots out there on a particular issue or a particular topic, the loud voice kind of thing that Dr. Reese was talking about. When you force everybody, because you couldn't pick and choose, everybody had to participate in each of the war games and hear everybody else out. So you had to defend your position against everybody from a combined arms perspective. It was nothing done in isolation, which I think was powerful in terms of making sure you have integrated solutions as opposed to somebody's favorite hobby horse solution kind of thing.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. And they led to two things, right? One thing was redundancies, or at least potential redundancies that are out there. And if you're in a resource-constrained environment or you have new capability coming online that you don't necessarily have a bill payer for, it allowed you then to have some options to pay for those. But then it also it kind of led to what else were we missing, right? And the last two lines of effort that kind of led to that was the protection line of effort that we've been working on, and then the information line of effort. So the protection line of effort is, okay, the warfighting function of protection is, is some senior leaders had talked about before, is just something that we've always thought about afterwards, right? We developed a plan and then we sprinkle some protection on it, is a phrase that people like to use a little bit. But now, because the enemy can see us, because the operational environment has changed, because we're dealing with peer threats, they can see us at all times. Protection has to be an integrated piece of that. So we've really been in a hard effort on this line of effort to push protection, unity of effort, unity of command within that warfighting function. What belongs in the warfighting function, and how do we make sure that we have the single point of contact on a staff, a division or corps staff that the commander can turn to and talk about protection with. So that's been a really big focus of that on the staffs, as well as then the rear area. So how many times have we had some organization, all well-meaning, just show up in your battle space and say, I'm here to help, and then all of a sudden it drains 3 platoons worth of combat power to help. So how do we do that? How do we get unity of effort in the rear area too? One of the number one things coming back from every warfighter is that nobody controls the rear areas very well. Because everybody's focused forward. So how do we then establish PROTEPs? An option is a protection brigade, similar to a MEB, but with a little bit more capability that currently exists to get after that unity of effort in the rear areas. So that's a big line of effort that the Maneuver Support Center of Excellence has been leading us on. Obviously, everybody in collaboration with that. And then information, right? Information is another gap that we've been spending a lot of time on, and I won't get into all the details about that, but what we have been working on with the Cyber Center, and then obviously with the Doctrine Division here at Fort Leavenworth, is what is that right mix of information advantage capabilities at Echelon? What do we need at Echelon to get after this? How do we compete in the information domain, and how do we get after all that kind of stuff? And right now we just don't have the right thing, so we're working through a bunch of different options. Whether or not we need new formations, do we need organizational redesign at Echelon in order to try and get after that and do that. We've had a big summit out here at Leavenworth within the last couple of months to get our doctrine straight, and now we're moving out with what are some options that the senior leaders can choose from as far as formations and staff goes. And then the last thing, and it's really not the last thing, it probably should be the first thing, is just the doctrine in general, right? So as Mr. Creed talked about, is we got to have that in place so we can move forward, because none of this stuff that we're bringing on board, none of these things that we're trying to develop or change our organizational is any good if we don't have the right doctrine for it. We don't have the soldiers who can train on this type of stuff, and we don't have the right leaders. So it's all kind of founded in that last line of effort, which is making sure we have good doctrine in place as we go forward. So that's kind of Waypoint in a nutshell. It's Waypoint 2028, Waypoint 2028, 29. We've decided, not we, the senior leaders have kind of decided, we need to relook this, right? Every year, our goal is out here, Aimpoint 2035, that multi-domain capable Army that's out there. How do we adjust every year as we go forward to make sure we're on azimuth to get out there? So I think that's very important, and to provide senior leaders options to move forward. So we're in a really good place moving forward, and we got a lot of work to do as we go forward.
Well, thanks, sir, for that. It's definitely a large undertaking, and it has to be flexible, I think, to stay viable. But I'm curious, and maybe Colonel Karlberg, you can help us out with this. How does this Waypoint 2028 relate to the wider Army modernization strategy?
All right, so Army Futures Command wrote the modernization strategy, and they maintain it every year. So inside that, they not only have material solutions, right? They aren't addressing just material gaps. They have concepts that have organizational concepts, right? And a couple of the formations that they think we need in 2035, Waypoint is setting the seed corn for, right? So Theater Strike Effects Group have a capacity that Army Futures Command thinks we need. We agree. I mean, they've experimented on it, and so that's a part of Waypoint. The information advantage work that we've done, we put a lot more meat on the bones than existed when they had the icon on aim point, and now I think the Army understands a little better what it is. They know, I mean, we do not do well in the information fight, if you want to say that, and we need a means to address it, and it's figuring out, now that we've got some ideas on the table to experiment with, we'll figure it out and run that experimentation. And then MDTF was a part of the 17 gaps, the multi-domain task force was, but it's providing a landing spot for a lot of multi-domain capability that's coming online as soon as next year. I think we're rolling out some of the first parts of it. But the challenge with that is the man train, right? The equip's coming, but you've got to man and train that formation. So Fire Center, Cyber Center, Intel Center are all behind. You know, Army Futures Command's awesome because it's bringing all this capability really fast, but the centers of excellence are required to generate the people to use that and to train it. And some of the capabilities require us to work with other services to get training. And coordinating all that in the year of execution or in the near future is a challenge resource-wise for the big Army, for the department.
And there's ongoing mission analysis, right? So, yeah, the old joke about if you don't do mission analysis up front, you're going to do it before you're done because you're never going to get where you need to be. And so it's a continuous run and staff estimate on some of these things. MDTF being a perfect example, you know, guys trying to write doctrine on that down there, but we don't have one yet. We've done some experimentation with them, but you know, we wanted to move fast as an Army to field some of these formations. So you end up in a situation where we may be rapidly updating doctrine like every few months as the capabilities come to bear, because while we know what the big problems are we're trying to solve, when it gets to fielding capabilities and formations and then training them out and then figuring out how to use them, that's where you're going to figure out whether you're focused on the right problem and you define the problems the right way. So we have lots of discussions about, okay, so we get this, so how are we going to use it? And what's the means through which it's employed? It's not the same as something else because it's new, but if the processes for employing it are going to be Army processes or joint processes, then what that does is drive you towards certain kinds of solutions, at least initially, until you can experiment with it. So if something is some really long-range surface-to-surface fire system of some sort, well, okay, if it's really long-range, then it's not materially different than how you would have to look at joint fires, right? So maybe I have to employ that through joint processes, through a service component other than the Army for a joint force commander. I mean, that could happen. And so we kind of have to keep all our options open, as they said, as we work our way through figuring out how to make these things work. We know they're good ideas. We know that they're going to work, but we got to figure out, do they all work together? Do we spread them out? Are they task organized, again, with somebody else? And those kinds of ideas. And all of these things are all of the gaps that ultimately have to be looked at that way, I think.
And I think that's one thing that doctrine really helped us as we went through this process, because I think we've got really well-developed integrating processes, right? The MDMP, the targeting process, the intelligence information collection process, and looking at how these formations and capabilities are utilized. And that's one thing the commander has said he doesn't want to change. We aren't adding a new, there isn't a multi-domain targeting process, there's the targeting process. And also the joint targeting process, which is a little different than ours, but we've got to play in that space because it goes to authorities. The ranges we're talking about, the systems that we're operating on require authorities, so you've got to go through that process because that's where you get at those authorities. And then it's a question of us working with the other services to get the targeting process to keep pace with our ability to service targets. As we identified targets earlier, we're going to need a process that's agile enough to service those targets through that process.
Sure. So I think it's key that the experimentation, the testing, the wargaming, kind of as we go along, is central to making this idea play out by 2028, and then definitely by obviously 2035 with the aim point force. So, Dr. Reese, if you could maybe give us some background on the as part of the campaign of learning, some of the experiments, simulations, and war games that we've done, or that you guys have done in support of Waypoint 2028?
Sure. No, and I think, back to the point about COVID has its pluses and minuses, right? So COVID allowed us to do How the Army Fights, allowed us to put a lot of maturity into this Waypoint 2028 idea. But at the same time, a lot of these ideas we were going to experiment on in Europe, right, for Defender Europe, and some of the forces that got caught halfway deployed, halfway, back here in CONUS. So we lost opportunities because of COVID, and we gained some opportunities because of COVID. So, but you're exactly right. There has to be that campaign of learning to get after this, because we are talking about potentially large amount of change for our Army. Shifting from a BCT centric to a division centric formation Army. And the things that Colonel Karlberg alluded to with the different lines of effort that we're working on, it affects every echelon of our Army. So we got to make sure we get it as right as possible. It won't be perfect, which is why we have organizations called like COL that get the lessons learned, and we can adapt and learn from that. But we do have to experiment with it. We do have to war game with it. So we have a lot of things going on. We're working very closely with Army Futures Command, particularly Futures and Concept Centers, and their experimentation capability that they have. The used to be the TRADOC Analysis Center, now the Analysis Center for the Army over here at Fort Leavenworth. We've done a lot of work with them on experimentations on what these formations can do or not do based on some new capabilities, new organizational design, and then, as Mr. Creed said, how do we employ them differently? So we've done a lot of work with them, and we're right in the middle right now. We're working with the Center for Army Analysis up at Fort Belvoir in a month-long war game right now, looking at some of our design formations, making sure that what we're doing makes us better, right? It doesn't do us any good to change for change or to change and degrade our capabilities. So right now we're in the middle of doing all those kinds of things. We have a couple more months of hard learning coming up before some of these designs we'll pitch to the senior leaders and see if they want to go left or right. But right now the initial results are coming back very positive, that we're taking the new capabilities are coming online with some of these new ideas of how to organize, and it's making us better and more lethal, more mobile. So right now positive, still a long way to go, but a lot of good things coming up through these experimentations with the war games, and then also with the joint warfighting assessments that go on every year, the Project Convergence experiments that the Futures Command runs every year. So there's a lot of good stuff on there that we'll be able to get back to tie this all up, back to our LISCO gap study, which was based on pages and pages of documentation. Same thing we need to do for the Waypoint Force to make sure we can back up what we really want to do. Yep.
Yes, sir.
But another thing to highlight is experimentation that was done in the run-up to the 17 gaps that used it. So there was, prior to the Defender, every year there was a fires exercise in Europe that kind of, because the ASCC saw the gap and wanted a problem, they thought they needed a theater fires command. So they experimented with it beginning in 2015, I think was the first one. And then every year after that. And that led to a well-developed organizational solution, the Theater Fires Command. And then with the MDTF in the Pacific, it is a capacity that has been involved in all of their theater level exercises since they stood it up in 2017, late 16, 17.
I have to check that date. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not 100%.
Infancy. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem too, is, a lot of these things take time to do, right? So it takes time to get the right personnel on board and make sure the right capabilities are there. So we have to be patient, but yet move at speed in order to bring some of these things online for our Army. Yep.
Well, and we're also trying to bring our allies, partners online. So, we used to do the Army warfighting experiment or Army warfighting assessment, and then it became the joint warfighting assessment, and it very quickly became combined in the sense of inviting allies and partners to do that. When we did the old, I don't remember what NIE stands for now, experiment that we did for a decade down at Fort Bliss, over time we had started to include allies in there too because of the technical interoperability bit. Because we started all this off when we talked about the gap study, it was 2 U.S. and an allied corps. And so we always say we fight with allies and partners, right? So if we want them to be able to contribute, we kind of have to show them some of the stuff we're working on, so that they have a hint, and that as they modernize their armies, they're kind of working on at least parallel lines, if not converging lines, to borrow a word.
Yeah, I mean, as we speak right now, we got 2 of our allies participating in a warfighter exercise, right? So to learn, to make sure that we're interoperable, we're not going to fight alone anywhere. So how do we make sure that we have our modernization efforts, our training efforts, our doctrine is all linked? Yep, that's a great point.
Well, seeing that this is Breaking Doctrine, it's only right that we circle back, I think, to the doctrine piece, and that's the line of effort number 6. Mr. Creed, could you drill down a little bit and give us an overview of what we're looking at doctrinally with Waypoint 2028?
Yeah, so I've kind of touched on a lot of these points. So line of effort 6 is doctrine, and it's about making sure our doctrine is modernized along with everything else that we're working on. E.J. mentioned that some of the things are new, the information being one, that while we addressed in doctrine, we hadn't put the amount of intellectual effort into it that we have over the last year. And so what we're trying to do is, one, make sure that each of the lines of effort is doctrine informed. So again, not clean sheeting things, unless something just flat out doesn't exist. And there are a few things like that out there. MDTF would be a good example. There's bits and pieces of the MDTF that there's probably decent doctrine for, but there's other parts of it, because they're new capabilities, that they're not. So identifying what needs to be revised, what needs to be started afresh, and then maybe in some cases, I haven't seen this yet, but there may be some cases where there's certain things we may not do the same way anymore, and so we might not do those. But what that means is it's incumbent upon us to participate in these events. And so we send smart folks out to listen in on each of these events and all the other lines of effort, to make sure that we have the right situational awareness, because there are things going on as part of the Waypoint effort that are not necessarily related tightly to some other priorities that we have. But we need to make sure, for example, in our FM30 revision, that we don't put things in there that are contradicted by what we're doing and what we have learned in terms of the experimentation during Waypoint and Aimpoint. So those are the big things, really.
Now, sir, how does it actually play out with the Force Design Update, or FDU? How does the doctrine world that we live in, how is it impacted by the FDU, and what's that relationship generally look like as we create these new organizations?
Yeah, there's kind of a push-pull aspect to it. So talk about divisions as an example. So we did doctrine when we did the 3.0 revision, and we realized that this idea of a rear area, the Army had done away with rear area command posts for its divisions probably 15, 20 years ago. And so we didn't have that capability. So the E.J. talked about divisions, task organized cavalry squadron-like organizations. Well, each of the divisions has been task organizing something called the Support Area Command Post for almost 5 years now, since General Milley was at ForceCom, or certainly General Abrams. And it was never really adequate, and because it was always kind of a pickup game, and so folks looked at it differently. And so what we put in the doctrine was that some entity at the division needed to command and control the operations that take place between the close area and the division rear boundary. So over time, that informed some FDUs in terms of providing a small number of people and some equipment dedicated to that purpose. And that will probably get updated again here in the future. That's an example. But there's also examples of FDUs in terms of changes to organizations or new organizations or so forth, that makes us go back to doctrine and say, hey, we need to update this because we can now account for this better capability and maybe expand the roles and responsibilities of a particular echelon. We have more time to respond to the latter example, right? Because that doesn't happen real fast. It's usually a flash to bang time for a couple of years. There are some times where we move much faster than that. And SFAB, the Security Force Assistance Brigade, and the MDTF are two very recent examples of moving much faster than waiting a couple of years before we react.
You'll have to get Mr. Tuig on for for a podcast, you may need 2 or 3 of them to explain the whole FDU process. So,
Yeah, that could be a tough one.
yeah,
Just keep it at the wave tops, I think, is safe for that. Now, sir, could you give us a preview of any of the pubs that you're expecting to see in support of Waypoint 2028?
Yeah, so we've got really 2 big ones from our perspective. So the FM 3.0 revision that's going to make multi-domain operations the Army's operating concept. It's going to be evolutionary from unified land operations. So as such, all the things that we say the Army has to do now will continue to do. But we evolve towards some of the problem sets, very specific problem sets that MDO is designed to deal with. Essentially a peer threat that can contest you through a layered defense, and against which we have to conduct expeditionary offensive operations where the Joint Force will be contested in every domain. And so you're talking about long-range surface-to-surface fires, long-range integrated air defenses, and then in both cases, systems that are enabled by a global ISR network. So we're narrowing the problem set from a general discussion of MDO to very specific cases where Army forces would be employed by Joint Force commanders. So that's our big effort in CAD. The next priority, and we're working in parallel, but it's probably going to lag by a few months just so that we can make all the pieces fit together, is an Army doctrinal publication on information. It'll be the first one we have on that topic, and it'll be fairly broad to link all the different applications and uses, military uses of information, whether it's data as a commodity or employing Army capabilities to generate cognitive effects against either an enemy or an adversary or another interested party, an audience, right? So those are big bits. The other thing that we're doing, and we're doing it in real time as part in support of the Waypoint 2028 and Aimpoint 2035, is updating our echelons of a brigade publications. So as these guys and their teams work through the redesign of divisions and corps, the roles and responsibilities of divisions, corps, and theater armies, we are capturing that and updating that doctrine this year as we go, so that when we finish 3.0, they all are in alignment with each other. So there'll be some things that are released first, for example, in those books, because we haven't finished the other ones yet, and that's okay, because it's a continuous process. We can't just snap a chalk line and change everything at once, so we're changing it as we go. Those are the big ones, I think, the most applicable to what we're talking about today.
Now, with the information piece, because I know this is quite the buzz in the Army and whatnot, and different camps have formed. Can you give us any insight on as to what we think that doctrinal manual will look like, and how we visualize information and the information environment? Is it a domain? Is it any of that, sir, that you wish to comment on at this point?
Yeah, so like these guys, I can say that I spent COVID working on information with other folks around the Army. I mean, that's really been something that we've been trying to get after. So there's, all kinds of challenges with defining what exactly the problem is we're trying to solve, And so one of the great frustrations is people say, the Army's got to do this and the Army's got to do that. Well, the Army doesn't do anything. The Army's an institution. It's a force provider to the Joint Force Commanders since Goldwater Nichols, right? So we don't fight wars or campaigns. We don't conduct anything except under the authorities of a Joint Force Commander. From an Army, DOPMIL PF perspective, right? We provide capabilities. And so defining the problems in the information realm is always a challenge, because we say, oh, we're getting our butts kicked in, election interference or something. Well, okay, that's great. Maybe true, maybe not. But even if it is true, what do you want the Army to do about it? And so that what drives us back towards, what is Army or green contribute to the Joint Force fight in purple, contribute to the whole of government effort in red, white, and blue. And so we keep working our way back to that. And I think we've made a great amount of progress over the last year. We recognize that all Army capabilities can generate cognitive effects in the human or information dimensions of an operational environment. In fact, we're going to look at the operational environment a little differently in terms of one operational environment comprised of the 3 dimensions of human, physical, and information. Why did we do that? Well, because Army formations operate in assigned areas of operations. And so if you think of the domains as a global construct, every assigned area of operations has 3 dimensions representing an OE that affects what Army formations do. So just that baseline that General Rainey gave us to work with gives us the ability to keep things from being stovepiped and separate, and making information considerations, the human and information dimensions of an OE, and then how we employ, whether they're human or information capabilities or physical capabilities, to influence each of the 3 dimensions. They're all intertwined. And so that's where we're going. So I mentioned ADP 3 or 313. That's what we're going to call the ADP on information, and there'll be a field manual that we work on that's going to be called Information Advantage, or Information Advantage Activities. We haven't finished the name yet, but that's going to be about employing Army capabilities to generate cognitive effects in the human dimension, using information, what we used to call information capabilities, or information itself, to change perceptions, to influence behavior and so forth. But to also not forget that physical capabilities can be used to generate cognitive effects or change behavior as well. And that happens above and below the threshold of armed conflict. See, that's the tough part, the challenge with dealing with information. And, our enemies will talk about, our adversaries will talk about information warfare, but, that's the one method of conflict that spans the competition continuum. It happens below the threshold of armed conflict, it happens above the threshold of armed conflict. And you have very different authorities and different things that you're allowed to do. And so how does the Army fit into that? So that's the challenge that we're working after, but we think we've got, you mentioned the Information Summit that was here in February. We think we got all the guidance we need to really, knock out some good first drafts and then see what the rest of the Army says about it.
Now, given that a lot of our information capabilities are obviously constrained by authorities, as you mentioned, sir, I think what a lot of our listeners might be concerned with is how we understand the environment. You mentioned the new, or I guess not the new, but the way we're going to reframe kind of looking at the OE with those 3 dimensions and 5 domains. Do you foresee a change to the frameworks that we use doctrinally in understanding and visualizing the OE? And I mean specifically PMESI, PT, ASCOPE, METTC. Do you see that changing at all, sir?
Well, so we had information as a component to PMESI, for example, right? And when you made it a separate thing, I think we inadvertently stovepiped it off as a separate thing. Okay, you guys on the staff go over work on the I piece of PMESI. So what we did is with METTC, the old very tactical operational or tactical variables, right? Is we've added information to METTC. And so we're going to call it METTCI, but there's not going to be a separate I column of things to think about. The I is going to be worked into the METTC piece of it, because if you're going to integrate your approach to it, it needs to be integrated in the political, the military. It needs to be into how we look at terrain, how we can have civil considerations, pretty much everything other than weather. But even things like terrain have information impacts on people's perceptions, right? So you kind of have to think about those kinds of things. So that's how we're going to get after it. The operational framework will be largely the same. We'll use the same tools, but we're going to be more inclusive in terms of addressing information in a straightforward manner. All things about information, whether it's the data and how we exchange data, process data, and so forth, knowledge management, information management kind of things. Or about doing things in such a way to generate cognitive effects deliberately and make that central to the operations process. So that's how we're planning to get after it. So it'll be interesting to see how it's received.
Well, gentlemen, is there anything I missed that we should discuss, or have we covered all things Waypoint 28?
I think I would be remiss if I didn't add, since I'm supposedly the integration director. We talked a lot about doctrine, organization, and material, right? Okay, but there is the rest of .mil.pf that needs to be key, and particularly here at the Combined Arms Center is very important for the training side and for the leader development side. So I think, as people think about Waypoint and we think about Aimpoint, it has to be that total package. It doesn't do us any good to have all this new kit, this new doctrine, these new organizations if we don't know how to train with them and we don't have the right leaders for them. So we're doing a lot CAC-T is doing a lot in the training environment world, along with the proponents, but particularly at the CTCs. How do we modernize our CTCs to train these capabilities? How do we make sure our simulations that we go through reflect the new capabilities that we're getting? How do we do training at home stations and multi-domain ranges and things like that? So there's a large effort in that regard. And then on the leader development side, General Marini's number one priority, making sure that we have the leaders set, right? Making sure we have leaders that can lead us into the future, can lead these new multi-domain formations, have the right knowledge, skills, behaviors to lead us into the future. So I think it's that whole total package that, when delivered for the Army, as it comes online, is going to be very powerful. So I think that's important.
And that's a process.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we didn't like snap our fingers and all of a sudden become the Airland Battle Army, right? It took a lot of effort to educate the force, senior leader involvement, testing, right? You remember how, you were expected, there were certain things everybody was expected to know. It didn't matter what kind of formation you were a part of, what your branch was, or anything else. It was, all right, so I know, when I come out of this school, what my contribution is supposed to be as an infantry officer, an ordnance officer, whatever. So I think that'll be,
That's a good point.
the follow-through is huge.
Yeah, and I would say we've been flat, right? It's not a TRADOC. This isn't a TRADOC effort. This is an Army effort. We've been very open with FORSCOM, divisions and corps, and ASCCs. We've had multiple engagements with all of them. So it's informed. This is informed by dialogue, by commander to commander dialogue across the Army. I think that's part of the reason that it's gained so much momentum. And I think the other thing to highlight, to go to Paul's point on training and people, is our relationship with FORSCOM has improved, but FORSCOM's got a thing called REARM, which is how we're going to get to Waypoint, right? It normalizes modernization across the Army, trying to generate some stability for units. And by doing that, it's going to help us program this, and it'll help us get the right people to the right place, because they'll know when it's going to happen 2 or 3 years from now, so that we can prime the pump, so to speak, to get the training done, the institutional training done prior to that formation coming into existence. So I think that's
Helps us
important.
balance the readiness and modernization piece together, sir. Roger. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you for joining me today.
Good to be here, Chris. Thanks.
I'd also like to thank our listeners and note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Major Chris Parker, and this is Breaking Doctrine.